I'm the mother of Sade. This demon and his whole ass attorney, they knew exactly what he did and what he was responsible for. They took us through extreme agony and pain. We are already dealing with so much trauma.
There are no words that I can share that will reduce your pain. They're all in my thoughts every single day. Although it is not the same, having lost a boy that was like a son to me 10 years ago, I have some sense of what you are feeling.
Picture this. A cool spring night in Milwaukee, the city lights glittering off the dark waters of Lake Michigan, bars buzzing with laughter, and a young woman named Sade Carlene Robinson, just 19 years old, vibrant, ambitious, full of dreams, heading out for what should have been an ordinary night. She was a bright college student at Milwaukee Area Technical College, a young woman who loved fashion and carried herself with a quiet confidence, her whole future ahead of her. It was April 1st, 2024, and she agreed to meet a man she'd recently connected with, a man who seemed like nothing out of the ordinary, 33-year-old Maxwell Anderson. To anyone passing by, their night would have looked like any other casual date. Drinks at a local bar, conversation, a new connection blooming under the glow of neon lights. But what you're about to hear isn't just another first date story. It's a descent into a nightmare so horrifying that a judge would later call it something out of a horror novel. A crime so depraved, it left seasoned detectives shaking their heads in disbelief and a community reeling with anger and grief. Surveillance cameras captured pieces of their night together. Two people bar hopping, Anderson leading Sade back toward his apartment in the early hours of the morning. What no camera could capture, though, was the sinister intent brewing beneath Anderson's calm exterior, a darkness so deep it would soon rob Sade of her life in ways no one could have imagined. Prosecutors would later present chilling evidence, photos from Anderson's own phone showing him groping Sade as she lay face down on his couch, likely incapacitated. The implication was clear. She wasn't aware, she couldn't consent, and she wouldn't survive. In those early hours of April 2nd, Anderson would begin a series of acts so cold and calculated that even now they are hard to comprehend. After killing Sade, how exactly? Prosecutors never fully detailed, though evidence suggested violence, restraint, and predation. Anderson transported her lifeless body to a secluded park along the shoreline of Lake Michigan. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that should bring peace. Instead, it was where Anderson turned a young woman into a crime scene. With chilling precision, he dismembered her body, cutting it into pieces, discarding parts along the shoreline and in playgrounds, burning her car in a back alley to cover his tracks, and slipping onto a bus to quietly ride home as though nothing had happened. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditation, control, and evil, laid bare in every grim detail, prosecutors would later share in court. As the sun rose over Milwaukee on April 2nd, the world carried on unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded in the dead of night. Sade's loved ones began to worry when she didn't respond to messages. Hours turned to days, and then came the first grim discovery. One of Sade's legs, washed ashore near a park where families played and joggers ran. The police investigation kicked into high gear. Search teams combed the shoreline, drones flew overhead, and soon, more horrific discoveries followed. Her other leg and a foot near a playground, a torso and an arm washed up along a beach in South Milwaukee. Her head was never found. Each discovery sent waves of horror rippling through the community, a cruel reminder that a predator had dismembered and scattered a young woman's body like discarded trash. Milwaukee was gripped by fear and sorrow. But behind the scenes, detectives were zeroing in on Anderson. Surveillance footage, cell phone tracking data, and forensic evidence painted a damning timeline. Anderson was the last person to see Sade alive, and her car, later found burned, was traced back to him. He wasn't just a suspect. He was a predator, who had left a trail of evidence in his wake. The arrest brought a grim relief, but the case was far from over. In the courtroom months later, as the trial unfolded, the full scope of Anderson's depravity became public. Prosecutors revealed how he meticulously orchestrated the cover-up, using fire to destroy evidence and deliberately scattering her remains to make her body harder to recover. The jury listened in stunned silence as the prosecution described how Anderson groped Sade's lifeless or unconscious body, photographed her humiliation, and disposed of her as though she were nothing. There was no humanity, no remorse, no shred of decency in his actions, only cruelty. For Sade's family, every day in that courtroom was torture. Her mother, Sheena Scarborough, and her father, Carlos Robinson, faced the man who had destroyed their lives and spoke through tears about the daughter they would never see again. Sheena's words were sharp and raw, a mother's fury spilling into the courtroom as she called Anderson a demon and demanded he be returned back to hell as soon as possible. Carlos, equally devastated, expressed a rage that mirrored the community's, saying, "Everything that he did should be done to him. No man should be able to live after what he did. I can't get past this. I can't." Their pain was palpable, their voices cracking under the weight of grief, but their words cut through the courtroom like knives, reminding everyone that Sade wasn't just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a vibrant young woman with dreams and ambitions. Judge Laura Crivello, presiding over the case, was visibly shaken as she handed down Anderson's sentence. She refused to offer him even the possibility of parole, describing his crimes as unconscionable, beyond understanding, and out of a horror story. She pointed out his complete lack of remorse, noting that he still clung to a fabricated narrative that some stranger must have kidnapped Sade after she left his apartment. Crivello made it clear that his view of reality differs from the rest of the world, and in sentencing him to life without parole, plus additional years for dismemberment and arson, she ensured that Maxwell Anderson would die behind bars. The courtroom was silent as her words echoed, a somber acknowledgement that justice, while delivered, could never bring Sade back. But this case was more than a sentencing. It was a reckoning for a city and a grim reflection of the danger women face simply for trusting the wrong person. Sade's story captured national headlines not only because of the brutality of her murder, but because it shattered the illusion of safety in ordinary moments. This wasn't a victim who lived a risky lifestyle or placed herself in an obviously dangerous situation. This was a young college student meeting someone for drinks, a scenario countless women experience every day. Her murder was a reminder of the predators who walk among us, blending into society, waiting for moments to strike. For investigators, even hardened law enforcement officers, the case left a mark. One officer described it as among the most disturbing cases he had ever seen, not only because of the violence, but because of Anderson's coldness and methodical planning. There was no frenzy, no panic, only chilling precision. Sade's story now lives on as both a cautionary tale and a rallying cry for justice. Her family continues to speak about her vibrant personality, her dreams of finishing college and building a future, and their unimaginable grief. They have vowed to keep her memory alive, not as a victim defined by her death, but as a beautiful soul whose life was stolen by a monster. In Milwaukee, her name has become synonymous with resilience, as friends and strangers alike gather for vigils, light candles, and demand safer communities for women. For Anderson, prison will be a lifetime of isolation, his crimes ensuring that he will never walk free again. But for Sade's loved ones, there will never be true closure. No sentence, no punishment, no prison term can undo the nightmare of losing a daughter in such a brutal way. And yet, in telling her story, in speaking her name, her family and community refused to let her be forgotten. Imagine being part of the Milwaukee Police Department on April 3, 2024, waking up to a call that would forever alter your career. A human leg had been discovered in a park, the kind of call that makes even veteran officers pause. At first, there was hope. Maybe this was a medical specimen, a gruesome prank, or anything but what it truly was. But forensic analysis confirmed the unthinkable. The leg belonged to a young woman, and soon, other parts of her body began appearing like scattered pieces of a horrifying puzzle. A torso washed up along the Lake Michigan shoreline, an arm tangled in debris, another leg and a foot discovered near a playground where children played just days before, unaware of the nightmare buried beneath their swing sets. What detectives faced wasn't just a murder investigation. It was a calculated, sadistic act of violence that spoke of someone with no empathy, no hesitation, and no regard for human dignity. The urgency was palpable. Every officer working the case understood that whoever did this wasn't just a killer. He was a predator capable of extraordinary cruelty. The forensic team moved quickly, analyzing surveillance footage from multiple locations, tracing Sade Robinson's last known movements. They found her car burned behind an abandoned building, a chilling sign of an attempt to destroy evidence. Inside the vehicle, investigators recovered charred fragments and DNA, enough to link the vehicle's destruction to Maxwell Anderson. Anderson wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. His record included misdemeanors related to domestic violence, though nothing that hinted at the depths of depravity he would display in this case. He had served in the U.S. Navy, a detail his defense team would later emphasize, but his service record and background did little to explain the darkness in his actions. Through meticulous detective work, police reconstructed the timeline of Sade's final hours. Cell phone data showed that she and Anderson had exchanged messages leading up to April 1st, agreeing to meet for drinks. Surveillance video from 2 Milwaukee bars captured them together, Anderson appearing calm, confident, and unremarkable, a face you wouldn't remember in a crowd, the kind of man who could pass unnoticed anywhere. They left together and went back to Anderson's apartment, a detail confirmed by building security footage. What happened next wasn't captured in full, but the clues left behind painted a grim picture. On Anderson's phone, investigators found disturbing photographs of Sade lying face down on his couch, her body limp, her vulnerability exploited. She wasn't posing, she wasn't aware. These images would later become key evidence at trial, proof that Anderson's intentions were never innocent. For prosecutors, the case was as much about method as it was about motive. Anderson's actions after Sade's death revealed a chilling level of planning. The dismemberment wasn't rushed, it was systematic. Investigators determined that Anderson transported Sade's body to a secluded park along Lake Michigan, an area dark and deserted at night. There, he cut her body into pieces, discarding parts in various locations to hinder discovery. He later burned her car in an attempt to erase any connection between them. But what he hadn't anticipated was the relentless attention of forensic investigators, who pieced together the evidence like shards of glass. The timeline of her death became clearer. She was last seen alive in his apartment in the early hours of April 2nd, and her remains began surfacing shortly after. Surveillance cameras, phone records, GPS data, and witness statements all pointed to Anderson as the sole suspect. By the time police arrived at his apartment, they had enough evidence to arrest him. The trial, which unfolded over the following months, was a masterclass in both forensic investigation and prosecutorial precision. In June 2025, a jury sat in stunned silence as prosecutors laid out the case against Anderson, detailing the brutality of his crimes. They didn't just focus on the murder. They made the jury feel the cruelty, the humiliation, the cold calculation behind every action. Prosecutors argued that Anderson deliberately incapacitated Sade, took photographs of her in a vulnerable state, killed her, and then systematically mutilated her body to cover his tracks. They painted a picture of a predator hiding in plain sight, someone who preyed on a young woman's trust, lured her into a false sense of safety, and then stripped her of her life and dignity. Anderson's defense team attempted to cast doubt, suggesting that someone else could have harmed Sade A. after she left his apartment. They pointed to his mental health struggles, his military service, and argued that he wasn't the monster the prosecution described. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Anderson's demeanor in court did little to help him. Throughout the trial, Sade's family filled the courtroom, their grief a silent but powerful force. Her mother, Sheena, sat through graphic testimony and gruesome photographs, tears streaming down her face as she clutched family members for support. Her father, Carlos, glared at Anderson with a fury only a grieving parent can hold, his hands shaking as he listened to prosecutors describe how his daughter's body was cut apart. Journalists covering the case described the atmosphere in the courtroom as heavy, a tension that hung over every testimony and piece of evidence. It wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. The city of Milwaukee followed every development closely, outraged and horrified by the story of a young woman whose life was cut short by a man she barely knew. When the jury delivered their verdict in June, guilty on all counts, there was no audible celebration, only a solemn sense of justice. The charges were damning: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, arson, and hiding a corpse. Each conviction painted another layer of the horror Anderson inflicted, and together, they told a story that left no room for mercy. At sentencing, Judge Laura Crivello spoke with a mixture of sorrow and fury. She called Anderson's crimes unconscionable and irredeemable, saying his actions read like a horror story, something beyond imagination. It's beyond imaginable to not know whether your child is dead or alive, and then learn they're dismembered and disgraced, she told the courtroom, her voice trembling at times. She handed down the harshest sentence available: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Anderson, who maintained his innocence and promised to appeal, stood stoically as the sentence was read, offering no visible remorse. His claim that a stranger had kidnapped and killed Sade after she left his apartment was dismissed as delusional and insulting to her family's pain. In her victim impact statement, Sheena Scarborough unleashed her grief in words that pierced the courtroom. She called Anderson a demon, saying, "I'm asking this demon be respectfully returned back to hell as soon as possible." Her words were raw, powerful, and deeply human. Carlos Robinson echoed that rage, his voice breaking as he said, "Everything that he did should be done to him. No man should be able to live after what he did. That's just how I feel. I can't get past this. I can't." These statements weren't just expressions of pain. They were indictments of Anderson's humanity, or lack thereof. Their daughter had been stolen, mutilated, and discarded, and no punishment could ever feel like enough. The aftermath of the trial has left scars far beyond the Robinson family. Detectives and forensic teams have spoken openly about the emotional toll this case took on them. One investigator described it as one of the most disturbing cases I've seen in my entire career. noting that even seasoned officers struggled to process the brutality of Anderson's actions. Milwaukee residents, too, have felt the ripple effects of Sadie's murder, with community groups organizing vigils and rallies, demanding better protections for women and young people. Her story has become a cautionary tale about online dating and the hidden predators who can lurk behind ordinary profiles, but also a reminder of the fragility of life and the resilience of those left behind. For Anderson, prison is now a place of permanence. The additional sentences for mutilating a corpse and arson ensure he will never walk free again. His name has become synonymous with cruelty, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, masked by a smile over a drink. For Sadie's loved ones, every day without her is another reminder of the future she'll never see. The graduation ceremonies, the birthdays, the milestones of adulthood stolen from her. Yet, in their grief, her family has vowed to speak her name, to ensure her story doesn't become just another headline lost in the archives. Her life mattered, her dreams mattered, and her memory lives on through the people who loved her most.